Hey everybody, and welcome to another video. This is gonna be a quickie mini map pseudo guide, tips and tricks, whatever you want to call it. This is not going to be in-depth. This is just meant to give you a quick primer on how you should or could approach maps, specifically 1 versus 1 ranked maps. Today, we're gonna take a look at Plunjing Valley. This is especially meant for newer players, so players who struggle in 1 versus 1s or any particular map. And of course, as always, if you lose on a map or struggle with the map, watch replays, your own, someone else's, see what they do, how they approach it. In my mind, roughly at the very least, knowing where you can and should push or which positions you should always go for because they're very safe to get in the opener is crucial. Because you don't want to give you a rough example, build up a defensive position here, leave this for free, just give it to your opponent that they can countercap this +2 zone, right? When, if you just look at this from bird's eye view, Alpha is significantly closer to your spawn, so you should be considering placing units here. And I'm gonna divide this into 3 parts. Safe zones and areas, I should say, which are exactly what I just described. Zones and areas where you should or could push, and then just, some small little details about the map specifically, some things you should watch out for. And I'll be doing this just by, placing the units where, you should go or can go for free. That's not how you should do your opener, but I'll get to that in a second. And we're gonna start from Jolly spawn. And this is roughly what it should look like. Now, this is not the exact front line of where you arrive before your opponent. You would arrive here earlier. You might arrive here earlier depending on the units. But these are not necessarily positions that you should go for unless you decide to push there. So what I want to show you with this line, if you will, is generally speaking, you should never build up a defensive position at any position behind this. Of course, like I said at the start, there's going to be out-of-the-box games, weird games, strange games, but they're going to be rare. This is just a general, like in 90% of the cases, what would or could or should happen. Especially in the opener. At the end of the game, of course, or halfway through the game, things can look wildly different, but that's not what this is about. This is mainly about openings. So you should essentially never open for, building a defensive position here, when essentially at minimal risk, you could just build your defensive position here instead, and thus secure or defend whole of Alpha. Same with Bravo, right? Don't build your defensive line here, because then you're just not going to contest this. You don't have a whole lot of knowledge about this area intelligence. Go for this line, because, this is very safe to get. You're almost never going to expect, or should expect an opponent to push at least, with more than 1 or 2 units. Here, your opponent might try to probe with a chip unit there and see if maybe they get it for free, but you should basically never expect a strong push here. A similar situation in this position, Foxtrot can very much be contested. This is not free. And we're gonna paint a similar picture for Echo. And from the Echo side, it looks very, very similar, right? Delta is essentially yours, or should be yours. You get essentially part of Foxtrot for free, so to speak, just like the other side got Bravo. But as you notice, right, neither side gets this or this for free. Again, free in quotation marks. These are gonna be prime contested zones. This side very often tries to go for this push here. The other side very often tries to go for this push here. But neither side essentially gets there significantly faster than the other side. Again, assuming same speed of transports. So once again, don't bother building out a defensive position like this, right? Always strive to go for this. Now, it should be said, and you'll see that in a second, Charlie side has a very good opportunity to push Delta. So it is relatively likely that you end up, at least for a while, building a defensive position here. Damn, excuse my voice. Building a defensive position here, because the opponent had built a very strong push here. Had a very strong push here with a lot of units. But that's not what this is necessarily about. These positions are, of course, also crucial because they watch over the open field. And once again, this is essentially free. So, don't bother building up a defensive line here. In the opener, this is. Now, let's take a look at areas where you should or can push. Now for Echo side, and there's gonna be going for both sides really, there's gonna be the Bravo push, where you contest Bravo, and the Foxtrot push, where you try to fully conquer Foxtrot. In the case of Foxtrot, you're gonna try to, build up upon your strong defensive position that you get very easily and fully push your opponent out. And in the case of Bravo, you're gonna try to get a foothold in it and try to contest it. As always, or in general in Wargame, don't overextend. Think about whether you really need to push further, because if you get, for example, this position, you could of course try to get complete control over Bravo, but do you need to, right? Assuming that you have, for example, control of Delta and full control over Foxtrot, contesting Bravo gives you a +1 tick, which is, allowing you to gain the lead. Assuming, of course, your opponent isn't 400 points ahead and there's only 10 minutes left in the game, of course, there's not really a need to push for Bravo. Now, that doesn't always mean that you shouldn't do anything, like just sit there defensively. But just as general advice, for starters, first make sure you have this position secured, then think about what you want to do next, right? Don't immediately think, oh, you have to go for this part or this huge forest. This is what matters the most, because then you have a town to defend and the forest, and it's all surrounded by open field essentially, at least towards the enemy, meaning that you will see your opponent when they're attacking, and you have a lot of cover to retreat to as well, right? If your tank's at the edge, you can retreat fairly far back to get out of line of sight, out of artillery, AoE, etc., etc. Foxtrot, similar deal, right? Once you have this position, once you have this town, a lot of open field. Now there's of course this part here, and there's some very weird line, or like not very consistent line of sight, as you can see. Ground units are gonna have trouble spotting up here, and this is forest. But still, these buildings and this forest line here, good amount of open field. If your opponent decides to just put a CV in here while you have control over this town and this forest, suicidal, I'd say. Lastly, for the third push, right? These are all individual pushes. Don't go for all at once. Mid push. 2-point alpha push is possible. It's gonna be difficult. 2-point push is more easy from the Charlie spawn, I would say. That doesn't mean this is impossible. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but sometimes you also just notice, by units you spot and by the other units you see on the other side of the map, if your opponent has like a single infantry squad or something in there, they might be really, really light. If you get here early, it can be very difficult to get rid of you. If you have this town, and these forests, once again, lots of open field. You just have to be careful that if your opponent decides to push Bravo, and you decide to do an alpha push, you can very easily get flanked. You have a lot of open field here. You don't have a whole lot of cover from a reinforcement route here. It's going to be very easy to just cut you off from reinforcing and just, choke you off, so to speak. So these are the 3 pushes from the Echo spawn. Now, Charlie spawn has kind of 4 popular pushes as opposed to 3, or kind of like 3.5, and I'll get to that in a second. First of all, very similar. You fully get control of Bravo, just like you might do with Foxtrot from the other side, or you contest Foxtrot, just how you might do it with Bravo from the other side. The positions are basically the same, really. If you want to push Bravo, you want to get this full forest, you want to get the town. You might want to get this town. Sometimes it just happens automatically. Sometimes your opponent doesn't really have much there to begin with, or anything really. You probably want to get this. Technically, you don't need this, because even if your opponent has it, there's once again so much open field around it. It doesn't give them a huge advantage. But especially if you really have a big push here, there's generally only a few, there's only so many units that can be in here. You should try to get rid of it as well if you know there's something in there, unless you're really hurt from the opening. Then, of course, a mid push, which is easier from this side, because you have this big chunk of forest here of cover to work with, right? Assuming you get the big push down here, it's going to be really difficult for your opponent to know where exactly your units are positioned, right? You could be here, 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 a lot of forest to cover, right? You don't just want to go for this, you want to go at least for, right, this chunk and this chunk. Generally, you you know, unless you catch your opponent really off guard and you notice there's basically nothing there, or you know, your opponent didn't really notice, or like 90% of the units were fully invested into Foxtrot and they really went deep in there, then of course, you know, push deeper. That's a case by case basis. But in the long run, this is essentially the area that you should go for, and then you work from there. If you wanna get, you know, or wanna continue pushing or do more and not just sit there, I would suggest pushing into this part of the map, because of course that forest just simply connects, right? Then, you know, you can make shenanigans happen, cut off reinforcements here, and maybe later in the game push here. But if you're really in that position, you probably already won anyway. But yeah, with this huge forest, if you have a position established here, right? Even if your opponent has stuff here, your main reinforcement route goes like through this part, right? There's buildings, there's forests blocking this, and units here don't really have any line of sight on your reinforcement route. You still want to go for this, right? Never give this up. Even if you push from it, because once your opponent gets this town, then you know, you can get cut off, right? This town allows them to go for this forest and have proper line of sight. You still want to be careful, right, that you don't get shot here, but generally speaking, if you're that deep, you're gonna keep your opponent so busy that outside of whatever they had in the opener, there's probably not gonna be a lot more additional units in here. Now for the last, like the quote-unquote fourth push, which is kind of like a mix between two, you wanna push for this, right? You see there's essentially two lines here, there and there. These units are essentially signifying this, well, as it's been called, crescent forest push, right? Where instead of going for this line here to defend Foxtrot, you still kind of want to go for these buildings, but you're just going to send like a couple squads or a few units in there, not more than like 60, 70, 80 points, I would say. And focus on pushing across this open area here, and get a foothold in here. By doing this, you kind of force your opponent to react, so they almost certainly can't really afford to just continue pushing down here, because then it will just get side-shot. So you don't really need a whole lot of units to you know, hold this town or have optics in this town. And then you want to cut off units here, and actually in the long run do go for a full Foxtrot push as opposed to a full Bravo push from Echo, which is virtually never going to happen. And /or just be happy with this position and then move into Delta. But if you do this push, you of course still want to go here. I would not recommend also immediately going for this part here. As always, you know, you kind of go with the flow. If you notice there's not much, of course you want to send stuff in there as a general advice. Yeah, so, you know, to put it into a few words, push here, push there, or push here, right? That's essentially that. Now, as for little things you should be aware of, well, for one, there's buildings right at Charlie spawn, right? Where you land units spawn. If something like a Kustjäger at a 90 is probably the worst thing, LSCR, SAS, or any, really honestly any infantry gets in there, can do a huge amount of damage. So be wary of that. Other thing to be wary about is the line of sight here is very weird. Of course, from both sides really, there's a lot of mountainous foresty areas, so it is relatively easy to sneak something by. So be careful with your CV positioning, right? If you position your CV here, you should be really careful with base defense that you don't leave any of these lanes free, because something walking here won't really get spotted by something that is sitting there or there to defend the CV, right? So be aware of that. Very easy, very little open field here between these chunks of forests. From the other side, of course, huge amount of forest that directly goes into here. Basically both roads that you're gonna use are relatively easily cut offable, if you will, especially this one, so be wary of that. Small little thing, let's see if I can demonstrate it. You know, let's just unload this and get like a rover wombat to here. And the I've also demonstrated it. If you fast move towards mid, your units will try to take a shortcut through here. And the airstaff might not be slowed down very much, but something like a 50 km off-road speed truck will. Well, unfortunately I don't have any. Even the rover is 80. but they will always try to take this shortcut instead of trying to take this way, even if they have abysmal off-road speed. I assume it's because units don't take cover into account that slows them down, but that's just something to keep in mind. If you use something like a recon squad in the 5-point truck, which has abysmal off-road speed, you might want to fast move down here and then tell them to fast move up there. Just as a small word of advice. And that's really all there is to this map when it comes to special things. Everything else should be relatively obvious. I think this is one of the easier maps to learn because you only have so many zones. They're very, I would say, clearly marked in the sense that it's clear that Delta is essentially yours and Alpha your opponent's from the get-go, and either of you have to work to get into the other zone. So yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if it helped, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Bye bye.